Okay, thank you. And now welcome Charles Simonds.
Thank you for all coming. I think I should have baked a cake because of the looks of it. And thank you, Stephanie. I think I probably wouldn't have found my way here, so thanks for your cajoling and insistence, actually. And thanks to MoMA. It is true I haven't been here since 39 years or so. And I actually also would like to thank the Ad Reinhardt Foundation because I probably wouldn't be here were it not for them having helped me make my website, which is how Stephanie found me. So thanks to Anna and Rita. Thanks for coming also. I've given the talk off and on that usually just involves my work and what I do, but I'm going to expand it a little bit since it's been 39 years to some of sort of anecdotal information about my formative years, which this I'll use as a touchstone for our talk, at least the first part of it. It's a piece that I made in 1972 that actually belongs to MoMA. They acquired it a couple of years later, in 1974, I think. And it's about people who live by going around in a circle, if I can find my little pointer here, who, as the past falls down, they come back around again and they excavate the past and rebuild it into the present. So they sort of resonate on their past and reconsider it and so forth. And it's not unuseful in terms of the early trajectory of my work, in as much as most of my work is really an extrapolation of things that I figured out within 4 or 5 days in 1970. So it's all the sort of complexion of what I've thought about and what I've done is really largely, much of it is an extrapolation. And you've seen the two of the 4 rituals in the early films there that have to do with my relationship to the earth and my body and dwelling. And I'll explain all that later on in the talk, but I thought I'd use this as a little bit of a touchstone because I've sort of realized that actually, notwithstanding that all this stuff came to me in 1970, it didn't come to me sui generis just out of the blue. A lot of it certainly comes from things of my childhood and my upbringing. And I thought I would try to struggle through that. You'll have to sort of try to go along with me because it's not stuff that I've normally talked about. But I think it's going to take just a couple of minutes, and it's a childhood that I had to survive, which took a lot longer. So you'll just have to manage 5 minutes of me recounting a couple of anecdotes about my early years and what it did to me. Somewhere I should have a little clicker. Oh, there. Okay. So I grew up actually not much more than a mile from here on Central Park West. At that time in the 50s, it was sort of Shrinksville. Both my parents were psychoanalysts, and it seems that a lot of the psychoanalysts congregated on Central Park West in the 70s and 80s, in those streets, not the years. And you don't choose your parents, as it were. But I have some very first memories. I lived facing the park on Central Park West. And my first, for instance, auditory memories are, it gives you an idea of how old I am, or of the sound of coal going down a metal chute into my building, the delivery of coal. And a hurdy-gurdy man who had a little monkey who would stand below my 3rd floor window and catch the morning sun along with the pigeons facing east. And then the rest of my early childhood I remember as being essentially punctuated by 50-minute intervals. Well, which I'll explain. Those, I can tell by the chuckles, you know something of what I'm talking about. Tell something sociologically about you. But, sorry to say. But in any case, I would spend most of my time waiting for my brother to come home to play with me from kindergarten. And the rest of the time I would spend waiting for my mother to come out between patients. Both my parents were psychoanalysts. They had their offices in the home. And my mother would come out between the connecting door to check on me every 50 minutes. And she worked mostly with children, little children, sit on little chairs and play with a dollhouse in her office, a dollhouse which I was never actually allowed to touch because it had to preserve the setups of these special children. But she would come out and sort of check on me between patients. And notwithstanding her wisdom, there was one thing she didn't realize, which was that the door that she would use to go in and out of had a mirror on it. And so every 50 minutes, I would have this wonderful moment where she would come out, and then she would close the door, and I would be confronted with the image of myself having just been left, been abandoned. So I was basically, I felt abandoned every 50 minutes, and I had to sort of see what that looked like to feel that way. It's all true, sorry. And so, I mean, it sounds sort of funny, but it wasn't so fun. And then, as I went on, so I went then to sort of what I came to realize were called Pinko progressive grade schools in high school, Walden and New Lincoln School. Some of my alums are here with me tonight. Thank you for coming. And, you know, for instance, Andy Goodman went to Walden, and Minnie Jean Brown came to New Lincoln as a refugee. And most of the parents were sort of lefty, mostly living in the shadow of McCarthyism. Since many of them were academics, many of the parents, there was always this kind of anxiety around. And likewise, they were very involved in the civil rights movement. You know, if there always was a connection with these, commie Jews, as it were, who were fomenting the civil rights movement. And so the atmosphere was somehow involved in all that kind of stuff. My mother had her own particular, what do you want to say, thoughts about psychoanalysis. And I've spent a lot of time trying to live down her reputation. Her maiden name was Bell. Anita Bell was her name, and she was fairly notorious. And somewhere along the way, she had a kind of epiphany, and she was a member of the New York Psychoanalytic Society Institute. And she, with all her peers there, one day woke up to the idea that, well, castration anxiety really had nothing to do with penises, and was really all involved in ascending and disappearing testicles, and the conflation of elimination and so forth. And she resigned very vociferously from the New York Psychoanalytic Society, and then achieved the sort of name of Belle of the Balls from her peers. And to this day, if I go out socially, I run into somebody, they say, well, your parents, my mother's name is Belle. Oh, you mean Belle of the Balls, right? So I've had to deal with that. But I did learn somewhat later, and actually just a week ago, had a talk with Eric Kandel, who went through a similar experience. I think my mother's issue, which she then, for instance, went on from, having resigned from there, went on and did sleep research at Yale, and would wire people up and try to connect body issues to let them dream, did sleep research, let them dream, and then see body responses, and then wake them up and say, what are you dreaming about, and blah, blah, blah. But was trying to make a kind of relationship between mind-body issues. And I remember a week ago talked to Eric Kandel, who was of this same little circle, a little bit younger, but who knew all the same heads of the New York Psychoanalytic Society, who recounts a similar issue. He's a neuroscientist now, of sort of trying to deal with the fact that even though, for instance, traditional Freudianism posits an idea of, Freud posits an idea of a relation to the body and biology and physiology, that at that time, in the 50s, I guess you'd say, many of the psychoanalysts had somehow let that slip by. And so Eric recounts to me, for instance, asking them, well, what kind of basis under which are you sort of positing that you're doing something? Is there any kind of way of verifying what you're doing? And the answer from this head of New York Psychoanalytic was, well, it works, so we know it must be right. And, so Eric, for instance, then segued off into neuroscience. And I think my mother was doing a similar dissatisfaction with the issues of body-mind issues. In any case, I then went to, I should try to, along the way, my mom read to me, for instance, this story of Spotty the Rabbit. Most of you probably don't know it, but Spotty is born with spots in a white rabbit family. And he's told that he can't go to his grandfather's birthday party because it'll upset Grandpa. And so he's left at home, and of course he then runs away. And then in the dark woods in the rain, he's found by another spotted rabbit who takes him home. And there at that home are all spotted rabbits, except for one white rabbit, of course. And so they figure out that they better go back to Spotty's house, and they have this wonderful reunion at the end of both spotted and white rabbits. And I cried bitter tears over that, and made that, which is actually, I think, the first sculpture that I have from my childhood, if you will. In any case, I'll try to sort of sort this out for you a little. Yeah, we got all that. I and my brother had two. Oops, is that my phone? Had two natural gifts. One was mathematics, and one was modeling clay. And it was a time in high school, it was the shadow of McCarthyism, but it was also a time of Sputnik. And of course, all these schools wanted to find their science kids and their math kids and so forth. And so, for instance, early on, I was very obnoxious in math class, and I was putting up both my hands, and they finally kicked 4 of us out, and we set us up to make our own little math class with no teacher, where we did probability and statistics and symbolic logic and number theory and whatnot, and we got sent off to Watson Labs. At that time, was an IBM 360 computer. Was all of a sudden there were computers, and we had these punch cards to program these computers. We'd bring them back to school, and of course we'd drop them on the floor to show how special we were. And I lived in that idea. I was actually very interested in mathematics. And then along the way, my brother went off to college, and he left behind some clay. And I, one evening, made a little wrestler with lots of musculature and so forth, and I had the sensation of actually making something that I didn't know I was able to do. It was so realistic, and I was just watching my hands make this thing. And I put it in the shoebox and brought it to school, and of course, nobody at school believed that I made it. So I smashed it and made it again, right before everybody's eyes. And it pretty much solved for me the issue of what it was at the age when you're trying to figure out, well, what are you going to do, You're going to go to school and everything, college, and what is your thing? And I was thinking I was going to be an actuary or something like that. And that was the sort of progressive version of a mathematician at the moment, and aside from being a theoretical mathematician. And I then figured out, well, that's what I can do. I got this facility to work with clay, and my parents, in their limited wisdom, sent me off to study with a couple who made mostly church reliefs. And I studied a lot. I could make very good angel wings and pewty and stuff like that, and got very adept at that. Excuse me. And, Donatello and Ghiberti and Michelangelo became in my pantheon of that was what I was aspiring towards. And then I went off to college. And so, let's see. Did I forget anything here? Nope, we're okay. One thing we've left out. Oh. It'll come in the questions, I'm sure. Sure you're going to have questions about it. Let's see. So I went off to college, and I went to Berkeley, and I happened to arrive at the time of the free speech movement. And by chance, Mario Savio, who you actually see there, where's our little pointer? This is Mario Savio telling us all that we should lay our bodies on the gears of the administration and bring the university to a halt. Happened to live down the block from me. So I ended up actually on the steering committee of the free speech movement. And in fact, I played Where's Waldo? I'm pretty sure that's me right there. And I got very involved in that and learned a lot about, in spades, learned a lot about street theater, political street theater, and how to sort of do really theatrical political theater, if you will. A lot of the free speech movement had to do with very well orchestrated like Mario Savio carrying a scroll onto the stage of one of the amphitheaters and having to be wrestled off the stage. It was supposed to be a petition, but it was a petition that was 4 feet so that it would make a good visual image. And so he was wrestled off by the highway patrol, and of course it started a riot. And so I learned a lot about that kind of sense of the street and of theater in that way. And all these things, I think the reason I'm doing all this slogging through this is that I think you'll see as I talk about my work, which you'll see later on, there are a lot of these themes that come back very, very, very poignantly, I think, along the way. In any case, I'm part of the free speech movement. And the other thing that happened in Berkeley is I was sent by my English major friends, oh, Charles, you better go take this class with Stanley Fish. He had just arrived from Yale, and he was teaching Paradise Lost. And certainly he taught me what I still now know, that I believe is how to read what is, I guess, the most amazing book that was ever written. And he was developing a thought about how the reader experiences Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost has a certain kind of sentence structure where Milton sort of catches you up. That's what this particular book is about, Surprised by Sin, which was his original book about this. That, you know, that the structure of the sentences sort of invite you into a kind of sinful thought pattern, and then all of a sudden you're sort of caught up in, you know, schmuck, what were you thinking? That you get sort of whipped around and get a little morality lesson. And the whole issue of sort of morality plays and this kind of way of being very attuned to the reader, if you will, it was part of Stanley's ideas, had a big effect on me, as did, which I think is very particularly germane to what we're going to see in a few minutes, was the idea of epics and of odysseys. You know, My Little People is basically an endless epic, or an endless odyssey of these wandering people who are trying to get their act together. Somewhere in there is a kind of, my version is if you're going to try to do something about, or so to speak, make art, as it were, you've got to take in a fairly big shitload of stuff. It's not just some little thing. It's like, Milton trying to explain the ways of God to man, as it were. So it's something that what I'm trying to drive at. It's something to do with the scale of your endeavor has to be meet to what you're trying to accomplish. And certainly that I learned that lesson in a certain way from Stanley Fish. And then, we'll get to that. Then I went off to graduate school and wrote a thesis of 22 questions. Of course, the first was, what is art? And then along the way, Ad Reinhardt's work has visited my thinking very, very often. And that probably was the earliest moment at which it is, because one of the questions I said then, and I'm sure it was a reflection of Ad's thinking pattern, or thinking about his work, was, and what would art look like if there was no talk about art? In the sense of, for instance, I think of Reinhardt's work as the actual work is such a strongly quiet whisper. And then if you put that next to the what you would say, the polemics or the rhetoric of his writing. It's a very interesting question to me. It's like, well, what would art look like if there was no talk about art? And which is something of what working in the street has explained to me in some other ways. Anyway, along the way then, I moved then to New York, to Christie Street, and had a loft in a building with Gordon Matta. And we would go around, running around a lot, and I was making very strange kind of musings on my body fluids, if you will. I was fortunate my mother was still around, was a doctor. I would be able to get my blood taken from myself and bring home a little warm packet of blood and do all sorts of things with my blood and my urine and so forth and so on. And I make little sort of art historical kind of fantasies out of that, very esoteric and strange things, which I'll try not to show you. Strange things. But somewhere along the way then, I decided to try to, well, how do you want to say this? I had a loft, painted it white, sat down and tried to figure out, well, what am I doing? And I just tried to eliminate everything I'd learned, if you will. Tried to just think, well, what is it, And I ended up with myself, my body, the earth, and time. And that sort of brings us to what will be normally what people know about my work, and which I'll try now to explain. The only other thing that may be worth noting is that in the very beginning, when I started to then make, this is a little slab, it's not very big this, a little slab to make my bricks on, everything was still very ritualized. And so I made these little art historical kind of imageries just to provide myself with a place to cut my bricks, to make my dwellings, if you will. Early on, I figured out, okay, I have the earth, time, and my body, if you will. So let's see where we get to. Should move. Yep. So you saw the film Birth, which is up on top. If you think of yourself as buried, being born from the earth, some simple implications that the earth is a mother, you have a sexual relationship to the earth. If you think of this landscape body dwelling, which is this is a still from that film. If you think of your body as your first home, and you then transform your body into a landscape, it's a way of compacting a lot of these relationships. Mostly they're done, I do these as a kind of, they're not performances, they're just things that I do to refresh the relationships. There's a very structural relationship in all this, for myself in a very visceral way. It's a way of experiencing the relationships that I'm talking about. And so if you think of your body as your first home, you transform your body into a landscape, so it's at once your body and the land. I think you may have caught in the film, there's a little moment where I breathe and the earth breathes, so the earth becomes alive as a body. And then then I build myself into a house, make my home, as it were. Let's see if this works. And then I'll show you, this is a funny little, this is a little sequence of things that shows something that I did. I worked about 10, 15 years ago in a mental hospital in France with patients doing a communal project. And to present the project, I think I can go up there now. I don't like being down here. Oh, but I need the other thing. All right. I essentially showed these patients a kind of recapitulation of how my work began, which was essentially what you see there. I put down a piece of clay and then pushed it down, sprinkled some sand on it, had the idea of some bricks, started to build, and then introduced time. I mean, there's a funny irony, a kind of oxymoron in my work of building ruins, if you will. There's a kind of inherent pathos and oxymoronicness in it. I'm sort of creating ruins. So, whatever. There's a side of poignancy to that, if you will. But this is a way I sort of introduced an idea that that the patients and I worked on together, which you'll see later on in my talk. But it was a way of introducing how my work evolved. And there actually is the first work that I did, 1970, I think, where I just put some clay down and had the sense that it was a place. In the beginning, there were just many different kinds of ritual places. And then I was living on Christie Street, which is faced a park. And it was springtime, and kids were playing outside. It was hot, and I was in the back of my loft making my little dwellings, little objects. And I thought, well, it's stupid. You could be outside. I had already been doing a lot of things. Gordon and I used to go around doing a lot of works outside. I would take molds from parts of architecture and so forth. And so I went, still at that time I was thinking of myself as an artist. So I called some friend that I had on Green Street. This is sort of pre-Soho. I said, well, can I make a little dwelling on your window ledge? And he said, fine. And so I went and did that. And then I went and sat down in the gutter on Green Street and started to make dwellings. And basically, I had the idea of this imaginary civilization. I was going to make them dwelling places, and they were going to migrate their way up Green Street, which is what they did. They're just in the gutters and up on, you saw them in the films, actually. And so I wandered around with my dwellings. And along the way, Jeffrey Liu ran a place called 112 Green Street, some of you know. Said, well, why don't you make one, let's see if we have some of that. Make one, oh, it won't be here, so I'll wait and I'll come to that later. Did I do something wrong? No. Oh. Okay. So, I started to make these dwellings, and along the way I made one on 112 Green Street, and I would stand there making my dwellings, and try to imagine this is 1971 or so, 1970 actually. This is sort of the heyday of minimal art, and there I was standing out in the street making these little fantasies out of clay, kind of red sort of craft to most serious artists, and fantasy, which read kind of silly to most serious artists, and kind of weird. I think people reacted, well, I would stand there facing the wall, and I'd have, the truckers who were still there would come and dive in and ask about the little people and tell me about what happened to the little people last night and this and that and so. And the artists would come by, and I'd have all of a sudden this very silent presence behind me, sort of looking over my shoulder, and finally I'd turn around and say, well, what? And they'd sort of look at me like, and then walk away. So, or they'd say something ridiculous in my mind. So, or predictable in any case, I'll say that. And so I thought for a while, and I said, well, okay, I will go where I am welcome, as it were, which was the truckers, for instance. They were just, what happened? Let's get into it. So I went then to the neighborhood that I actually lived in, which is a part of the Lower East Side, a very particular geographic area. And I had the idea, okay, I'm going to infest this neighborhood, which is to say this group of people in time, with this imaginary civilization of little people. And I went and sat down in the gutter on, I think, between 8th and 9th Street on Avenue C, and immediately had a wonderful crowd of people. And, it was a hit, and everybody had a wonderful time. And I started to make these dwellings there, and very, very quickly, within a couple of weeks, people would come by, because, people come, hang out a bit, go back, get their friends, come by, hang out with me. They would then tell me, oh, I saw that dwelling over on 12th Street, but I didn't make a dwelling on 12th Street. So then I realized that actually the fantasy had already taken enough hold that people were imagining the dwellings where they weren't even there, which to me already signified that I'd already, in a certain way, accomplished what I was trying to do, in the sense of trying to create a kind of passage of a little mythology through a group of people's consciousness, that they would just sort of feel the gentle sway of these imaginary people. And I made them I made, I think, over 200 dwellings in that neighborhood over a period of 7 years. Many of the early dwellings have, habitation and ritual place. A lot of the ritual places in the beginning had sort of body references, sexualized landscapes. You can imagine how minimalist people felt about that. And I sort of hung out a lot. And it's worth trying to explain a little bit about what the dwelling's about, particularly in that neighborhood, because as you'll see since then, I've been all over the world with this. But in that neighborhood, they certainly created a kind of emblem of many of the issues in the neighborhood. I mean, you may have caught it in the film. The guy says, well, every time you try, we should fix up this lot. Or whatever you do around here is going to get broke, blah, blah, blah. And in a certain way, that was very true about the dwellings, notwithstanding that they were made with tweezers and very precious in a certain way, and people became very protective of them, for instance. There's a certain pattern to people's reactions. Work on a particular block, but that becomes their dwelling on that block, and then protected. And one guy says to another, if you touch that, I'll whip your ass. And so people put little visors over the dwelling, so forth and so on. They became very, a certain kind of focal point, and a certain kind of metaphor for the reality of the neighborhood, which at that time was in deep doo-doo. 30% of the buildings were vacant or vacant lots, and things were falling down everywhere. And so the dwelling certainly created a kind of emblem of that kind of thing, and it also created a kind of, I think, kind of political leverage in terms of people's awareness of the issues, in terms of trying to fix up the neighborhood and do things like that. So they picked up a lot of sort of political agendas, and I became very involved in that and followed up on that. Became a member of the Lower East Side Coalition for Human Housing, did a lot of sweat equity issues and parades and housing things, parks, that tried to, in a certain way, identify the people in the neighborhood, identify the neighborhood to themselves and what the issues were. And I think the dwellings played along in that. Along the way, what should do with both of these? Well, let's see what's next. And people would play with the dwelling. So this guy's adding a diving board. And I, of course, welcome that. They're very, how do you want to say, they become a place for people to play, in a way. Very often I'm working on a ledge like that, and I just extend the landscape a little further, and some kid or somebody would make their own dwelling, and then I make my dwelling, we talk to each other, and at the end we connect trails, and go back and forth about our fantasies. And I think to refer back to my poor long-lost mother, they did have the quality of kind of a shrink's couch, because you're talking about your fantasies, but you're not looking each other in the eye. People are endlessly verbalizing life stories to me that I think otherwise I'd be embarrassed to have to hear. But since we're just doing our thing, things come up that are quite surprising. And I spent a lot of time doing that. And one, as you noticed in the film, there's a guy who said, well, why don't we fix up this lot? One of the things I did was organize a group of people on 2nd Street. I was really the vehicle only, but it organized between an association of community service centers and a legal aid thing and a group of kids called the Young New Yorkers, kind of steering off from gangs and drugs. We made a play lot, and they painted a mural. It was their version of their history of coming from Puerto Rico and the promise of New York and the reality. And here's the opening of our play lot. Actually, it was 2 pieces of property, so we were only able to get this one. But essentially followed up on some of the things that the dwellings provoked, if you will. And I found it very, very, very satisfying, I have to say. Next, let's see. Doesn't always work. And of course, at the same time, I fantasized, this is that actual space as a little model. This is the one coordinate wall of New York, if you will, and this would have been the other, but I've taken off the side of it. And I made a little fantasy, as if in the same space, of, sort of a group of people, the geometry of whose architecture was 45 degrees askew to the coordinates of New York. So a way of sort of saying, well, there's another group of people who had a different orientation, different belief structure, and so on. And I had a wonderful feminist girlfriend who donated her bottoms and my sides to other fantasies for these things, so whatever. Sorry. And along the way, I still had a very ambivalence, a kind word for it, attitude towards the art people, if you will. And notwithstanding, wasn't then noticed by them and was being invited by them to go do things in museums and exhibitions and so on. Actually, this is, I think I mentioned this one. This is 112 Green Street. So I made a dwelling inside and outside of the gallery. It was an underground kind of gallery. And of course, the outside was destroyed very quickly, like normal life for the little people. And the inside was kept for a while as something special, as an art thing. And I, for instance, was invited to be at a Whitney Biennale. And at the time, I was most adamantly not involved in art. I said, well, no, I'm not going to come up here to this museum and make art. If you want, you can put a little label on the wall that says Charles Simonds, an artist who makes dwelling places for an imaginary civilization of little people. And if you go to such and such a spot, you can see one. And that was my, quote, conceptual reaction to try to deal with a museum. And actually, it pointed out something that was very clear to me even then, which is going to probably come up in some of the responses and questions, which was that funnily, the discovery of, for instance, these dwellings of people walking around in their everyday world and just sort of happening upon it is a much more, powerful experience than being sent, for instance, by a little sign that says if you go there, you'll go see something that's art. And it very, very clearly to me, in terms of how what I was doing was entering the world, made very transparent to me the differences of what was lost in that situation. Likewise, what's lost in having objects in a museum and so forth and so on. And it seems like a tremendous diminution of some of the issues of, obviously, time and space and metaphors of reality, things going on around you and so forth, that are very intentionally left out of museums or eliminated from museums. But notwithstanding, I was invited back to the Whitney for another Biennale, and my solution at that time was to build a dwelling on a building across the street, and then build a dwelling in the museum with little people shouldn't feel completely forlorn and lost. They had a little signal tower so they could sort of keep touch with the people who were outside and what was really going on other than the thing. And of course, these guys were whisked away very quickly after the show was over, and the guys out there actually stayed for a few years until the guy who owned the building sold his building, got divorced, and so forth. And a similar situation here where I was invited to a Venice Biennale. This is a courtyard of the museum, and I said, well, this is great, but it's kind of boring here in the museum. can we just chop a hole in the wall and to the back streets of Giudecca, and then at least the people out there can have a view into this, what's normally just a traveling cocktail party for art people. That at least they have some. And I got a lot of nice little notes from teenage girls in Italian. I have no idea what they were telling me, but it was very, very fun, very fun. That's a little picturesque one. That's the opening of PS1, actually. So along the way, and this might be more interesting, I've done these all over the world. I'm somewhere up like 500 or so. And as you'll see in China and Germany, I lived for a year, in France and so. And in fact, this is in France, in a little neighborhood called Belleville in the 70s, before it was in the movies and whatnot. And I actually, I've come to think of my dwellingness, making these dwellings, in my own personal way as a very, oh my goodness. Well, we might not get there. Whatever. I'll do my best, folks. I often think that they're very sort of an incantation of to dwell. Maybe it's the dollhouse I didn't have that my mother had, but it's a place where I go and try to find my home. And it's a kind of incantation of dwelling and a kind of endless recreation of that moment. And the dwellings are like an endless story, and each dwelling is not exactly successive to the ones before, but it's a continuous story. And the little people have a very elaborate history. And I actually have a fantasy that's very specific that wraps around each one. But at the same time, a lot of it has to do with the people who come by and the stories that they tell me. Because I don't usually, I'm not on a soapbox, and I don't actually divulge my story about the dwelling very often, almost never. I'd rather hear what they have to say, and I think mine is prejudicial if I tell it. So, but I do measure my life on maybe 10 fingers of the few people who've actually come along who've told me something that I really didn't know. And for instance, Josepha, who's a 10-year-old living in Paris, come from Spain, living with her aunt, whose first, some people you say, well, I'm making a dwelling for little people, they say, forget it. And other people say, well, that's interesting, let me think about that. And then you have Josepha, she comes along, she says, well, yeah, I know all about that. And in my world of the little people, if you eat something and you don't share it, it turns to poison in your mouth. And then she continued from there to explain something about, I guess, what I would call the kind of disappointments of, sort of moral disappointments of childhood going on towards adolescence. And instructed me greatly. Let me see where we are. So I will try to push onwards, I'm sorry. I've done this in China. The street's very friendly. This is there's always one guy who saw me first, which you could pick up in the film. It's very convenient because then I don't have to explain what I'm doing. Here's our guy, who then gave me a drawing of myself. People are very generous in the street. Okay, I will try to, this is going to be hard to get through, I'm sorry. Okay, the only other thing that maybe is abstracted from these dwellings is it's a lot of thoughts about how people live in time and space, relative to how architecture expresses their beliefs in that regard. And so sitting back and abstracting from the relatively peripatetic little people, I end up with linear, circular, and spiral people. So you have people who live by leaving the past behind, and they just sort of wander around. Sometimes families meet, and they end up making cities, and then they wander off again. Or you have people going around the circle, as we just saw from the early one. Or you have people who live in an ascending spiral, who bury the past and just use it as a building material. And I have taken trouble to try to write a little fictive ethnography about sort of a Swiftian thing about how it is to live in each one of these worlds. It's a kind of warped mirror towards the reality in a certain way. I think I'll just skip this because it'll take too long. I'm sorry. These you did want, so I will cover these. Sorry. This is actually the closest thing to a film, since I'm here on the context of a film issue, that I've ever dealt with. There's a series of works. A lot of my works are in series. And this is just sort of a cinema of the same place at different times. It's part of a large exhibition that traveled Europe and then the States and ended up at the Guggenheim. It was called Circles and Towers Growing. There's some issues of male and female forms, so that, for instance, this piece, there's some that precede this, but it's a sort of branching evolution. This space becomes that, and this one, which is the circles part, you can see some of the body references, becomes that, which becomes that. And then the other issue that is a very major aspect of what I'm involved in is growing. If you think of the earth building and all these body issues, there's also an issue of things that grow from the earth, which is pretty obvious. And so some of these are sort of mixed metaphors of earth and growth, but also, actually one of the 2 drawings I've ever made, this one, which is sort of a key work for me, that has to do with, there's I call it the growth house. And essentially it's a drawing of an idea that I did then make afterwards, but at the time didn't have a way to make, so I had to draw it, which is very painful to do. And what it begins as your shelter is built with bricks that have seeds inside. So what you build as your shelter, as time goes by, becomes your food, and you harvest it and eat it. And so in a certain way, it's a kind of marriage of building and growing. And since, as I've tried to point out, I'm the son of 2 shrinks, I actually think of this as a sort of hermaphroditic structure to the extent that, how do you want to say this? If you think of building, I do think of building as a kind of male imitation, or if you think of a male mystery of female fertility and growing, the male as a kind of imitation of that process, or a monkey kind of quality. How do I make that grow? It's sort of a way of marrying that issue of building and growing. It's my own Michigan, whatever. But actually, very early on, in 1970, I made a little sculpture that was built with these growth bricks, and actually also blood bricks. I had a lot of my blood when I used to collect my blood. It was very good. Since my mother was a doctor, it was easy to get. A lot of things were soaked in blood, but in any case, this was a little sculpture that had these bricks with seeds inside. I gave it to somebody, and then they watered it, and it grew, and so forth. And then, likewise, I made a lot of growth houses, and there were some other issues of making. This was in the Lower East Side, a building that was to be a kind of museum. Actually, now they have one, but at that time, it was like an empty building where we record the sounds of the people who used to live there and turn it into a kind of growth house. So we were very involved in growth and rejuvenation of the neighborhood, and symbolically and actually. This I won't spend a lot of time on because we'll get lost. But it was a proposal for a project. I was asked to make a memorial for a man named Stanley Tankel. That was my proposal, so that we wouldn't destroy the precious. This is a dunescape kind of conservationist dilemma of a resource that would be destroyed if it's used. So we were supposed to have, in the Gateway National Park, we were supposed to have some access for inner city kids to nature. I said, okay, high-rise campgrounds. This is just our little committee trying to do that. Marion, if you're out there, this is, and Tiziano, this is for you. These are the only 2 people with me who witnessed this. It took 9.5 seconds. Then I was invited to do Christo and I always seem to cross, but Christo was at the same time as my films here, 39 years ago, was Christo. And Christo was the first one to, when they made an architecture museum in Basel, of course they had Christo come and wrap it, and then unwrap it, and then they had me come, and I decided to turn the columns. It's a sort of modernist building. Let's see if I can go back. It's a simple modernist building, 3 columns and a platform and bearing wall. And I sort of just transformed it into, turned the pillars back into the trees that they were. It was sort of living, dying, and dead tree because they had acid rain issues at that time. So it was nice. You could tell which floor you were on by the thickness of the trunk. And then this I will cover, though. I'm sorry. Okay, whatever. Early on, I think 1971, I was making these fantasy dwelling places, and Smithson became a friend of mine, Robert Smithson. And, you know, he made a little drawing of a little park that was sort of towed around, fantasy, like a little park on a barge. And I thought that was great. I liked that idea. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be great if I could make, for instance, everyone their own personal fantasy landscape on a barge? And, you know, for instance, if I wanted to be on an English countryside and my best friend wanted to be on a South Sea island, we'd each have our landscapes, and we put them together, and we wanted to be together, we'd be together, and then if we wanted to be friends anymore, we could just float away. And it was a convenient idea. but nothing, I didn't know, but I didn't have any barges. But then about 6 years later, I started to read this stuff and discovered, they were building factories in Japan and floating them to Brazil because it was more efficient to do that. And I developed the idea of floating cities, and, well, you'll see in a minute. I wrote a kind of fictive issue of these communities that were being developed that were making land-based economies very paranoid because they could sort of reconfigure themselves and go around and do things very efficiently, and nobody knew where they were or what was going on. And it's sort of very specious, analogous issues for me with simple cellular organisms and aquatic, sort of specialization. And so, but I made this little model, it's basically a toy that I made that would be displayed as a kind of on a glass. This is just glass, little table. I had a little croupier stick, and every day I would go and reconfigure, a little industrial town or a little, what is that, a farm community? Let's see what we got here. There's a little farm community and so forth. And that was a way of investigating some of that. And I made sort of collages of that, montages. That was just instant house. How do you make instant house? I'm going to go quickly now because, okay. Many of my works are mixed metaphors between building and growing. So, for instance, wilted towers. Seems pretty obvious. Rock flower, if you will. The first person who bought a work of mine who I didn't know who he was, all of a sudden put my name up because he ran as the first surrealist candidate for Congress in New York State. He was a big Magritte collector, by the way. And all of a sudden he sent me this thing. He said, Charles, you didn't know that you endorsed me, but I did. I didn't mind. It was not a problem. Now, I will take this one occasion, and then I think we're almost there. So I do have very elaborate fantasies for all of these works that I do, and I rarely actually tell them. But I will tell this one because it'll give a kind of exemplary image of how I think about them. And so this is a work I gave to a lawyer, a very moral kind of person. And essentially the fantasy goes like this. This is after it's ruined, but these were little enclosures where the sort of accused was kept, and he's in the darkness, and then he is taken out for his trial, if you will. He can't see where he's going, and he goes along this path. All he sees is the sky and the earth. He goes up these steps. He can't see where that's headed. And then he comes out on this platform. And he's told that if he wants, he can just jump voluntarily and impale himself. You see all the bones of previous people. He can go down, just jump off and admit his guilt, as it were. Or he can end up having a trial, and so you have lawyers for and against, and a judge, and a jury. And, of course, the jury has little yellow clay balls. And if they judge him guilty at the end, they throw their balls, and then he's either pushed or jumps off. And if he's judged innocent, he walks out down this path, and he meets the judge, who then walks with him through his gates to freedom. And that's essentially the kind of fantasy that inhabits the dwellings that I make. Somewhere between childhood issues of good and bad and whatever, and also probably the source of this is one of those 1950s films where the Egyptian with the guys, people being thrown off things, sort of grade B movie. Is probably the source of that fantasy as best as I can make out. Then little people have a world of, this is teensy little work actually, evolutions of knives and of, the dildos, whatever. It's just like any other world. They have their own little thing. Along the way, actually, I did an exhibition, the Circles and Towers exhibition. Instead of having a catalog, we had this book, which was, I was living with Lucy Laporte at that time. And I asked her, well, what is this book? It's essentially a kind of diary. And I said, well, I asked her recently to say, because I knew I'd show this, I said, well, what was that about that you wrote there? And she said, oh, it's about an archaeologist who falls in love with somebody who comes from under the ground. And it's written in a very personal way. All the dates in it, for instance, correspond to dates in our relationships and so forth. But her version was that's what it was. And then I thought, well, okay, my version actually is sort of the, how do you want to say, the pitfalls or the sort of what happens when somebody gets too involved in this kind of Eros and Thanatos world of my little people. And because at the end of this, the person, this archaeologist, is the earth caves in on her and she dies, and so on and so forth. So a funny kind of, how do you want to say? I mean, I think I actually believe that's true. The little people have, there's this funny kind of innocence to them, but at the same time, they have a kind of, they tug on people in funny ways. I'll go through this very quickly. Is there something? Oh. A lot of my work involves the material that I work with. I dig the clay. Each clay has a history for me. They're not processed clays. They're just from the ground. So they have their own particular way of going from wet to dry. Sometimes I try to work from a smear, for instance, as a way of frustrating any kind of a priori image I might have, just to sort of allow myself to fantasize things that are not, most of the other works that you've seen are like pre-seen images in my head that I execute. So many of them, some of them will deal with perspective. Sometimes I go and chop holes in people's houses. This is actually one side, and this is the other side of this piece, which goes through a wall. Some of them address particular rooms in particular people's houses at a particular time in their life. So there's a kind of kinesthetic issue, somebody's bedrooms, blah, blah, blah. You can imagine for yourselves. So people let me chop up their balustrades, and some of them are obviously very body related. Some of them are placed or positioned in, for instance, as little Russian icon height, where each one has its own kind of version of where it is and what it is. I was one of the many friends of Saul LeWitt, I might say. And so we traded many works, actually. This is one that was in his home, and this is, I think, actually, one that he gave me the directions for the drawing, which I then could make the drawing myself, which was a fabulous experience. And I actually think of it as a portrait of my two children and me. I've done many strange ones. I think of these as actually equivalents. Often there's a figure in the landscape that I make. In the sense that the land always is full of figures, sort of a Leonardo kind of problem of horror vacui kind of situation. Francis. This is a very recent work called Mental Earth. A lot of my recent thoughts have to do with how do you detach yourself from a particular architectonic time and place, and particularly as you address, for instance, an interior art situation. Here's a kind of what's meant to be essentially the equivalent of a daydream, sort of something imagined in space in front of your face as you lay back and have a daydream. And so that it has no issue of time and place. A lot of the other work that I do is very invested and infected with issues of when and how and why. And these are meant to be very, very much just kind of invented in a mental place. It's called Mental Earth, for instance. I think we're almost there. The big work in the Guggenheim. Oh dear, oh dear. I did a big exhibition in the Jeu de Paume. At the same time, this is when I worked in the mental hospital, Rue de la Santé, which then encloses, this is the work that we made communally. Basically, it was patients sitting around as a kind of coffee clutch, making different chords of their own fantasies. And as I presented then those images that I showed you in the beginning, the issue became very quickly a kind of existential examination of a lot of the things that I think about. So, for instance, the wall, she's a wall, is this the wall of Rue de la Santé? Then they say, well, does it protect us, or does it protect people outside from us, or are we being protected from them, and so and so. And likewise, this woman made a stairs. I said, well, she said, well, why is the stairs? I said, where does it lead? And she said, well, why does the stairs have to lead anywhere? Why can't it just be a place to go to scream from? And so they're very, very it's very excruciating, actually. It sounds funny, but it's a very excruciating examination of simple architectural issues of inside, outside, time. For instance, when they saw the circular people, they're very, well, that's what we're doing. We're trying to reconstruct our present from our past in a way that's going to work, etc. And so it was very interesting. I work at other crazy institutions, such as SEV, and I drove them crazy, so whatever. This is porcelain, so people who are familiar with porcelain are usually a bit stunned to think that somebody can do that, which I think is true. Actually, a lot of what I do it does push at some issues of extremity. I think that may come up in some of the questions afterwards. We're almost done. Very recently, I did an exhibition at Dumbarton Oaks, and I sort of discovered that I was largely channeling Haina figures, for instance. This is an early work that's sort of an evolution of, from a pod to a pubescent torso to a laughing goat death mask, not dissimilar to some of the things that I found actually in there. I mean, they allowed me to sort of reinstall my work amidst their pre-Columbian, Byzantine, and rare books collection. So I, found some funny parallels with my work, and made also a little cabinet of curiosities where I drew from their collections of rare books and my objects. So for instance, well, you can try to figure it out, right? And likewise, my poor mom's there with her testicles. And, well, you get the picture, right? All right. Okay, I won't try to explain any of these. This is sort of stuff from the Cabinet of Curiosities. And I did try to do penance for all that I've done. I actually was the second person since 1492, the second American, to carry the Virgin in the Semana Santa in Bilbao. So I'm very proud of that. I really learned what penance is about because it's not an easy task. And my children are actually, my son obviously takes after me, likes to inadvertently pee on his great-grandmother's grave. Whatever, it was a hot day, so take your clothes off and play. We've got to be here for a while. I think that's the end. Let's see. I would like to say, since my talk is bracketed by the birthdays of my two favorite girls, women, Lucy, who you saw, happy birthday, Lucy, yesterday, and happy birthday, Leah, my daughter, tomorrow. Thank you for coming. And I think that's it. Thank you.